yeah, thank you so much for having me and for the work that you're all doing in the world. It's really important and feels really great to be able to show up and share with you all some of what we're doing at PSC and hopefully be of some use to you as well. So I'll just, I'll start by sharing my screen and pull up this first slide. Now, I'm, for the first time in my life, exploring a new thing across 2 screens, would you believe? So just forgive me while I resolve some of my developing tech abilities. Here we go. It should make it easier having 2 screens, but for some reason, because I'm so used to doing it all in like a tiny 11-inch screen, it makes it harder. So yeah, I'd also like to begin by acknowledging country. I want to pay my respects to the land on which I live and work, which is Wurundjeri land. And I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge that the sovereignty of the land of the Kulin Nations was never ceded, and pay my respect to elders past and present. So as Andrew said, I'm a facilitator, I'm an anthropologist. I'm really passionate and fascinated by the emotional and psychological dimensions of climate change impacts. And my facilitation training is really connected to supporting people to connect with their love of nature and rediscover a sense of agency through their expression of feelings. So beginning to kind of build that connection between emotions and action, which is often what I get asked the most about. I've been working with Psychology for a Safe Climate for the last 4 years, and our mission as an organisation is to support people in emotionally facing the climate crisis. We're a group of psychologists, psychotherapists, facilitators, and other mental health professionals, and we really aim to use our knowledge and skills to increase understanding and engagement with the psychological impact of ecological crisis and climate change. So tonight I'm going to be talking a bit with you about the usefulness and importance of making space to actually talk about our feelings about climate change and kind of explore those feelings. And once I've kind of given you a bit of a spiel on that, you'll also have a chance to have an experience of talking to each other in a sort of supported and structured way. And then after that, we'll kind of reflect together on how that process was and what you sort of noticed came up. So just go to my next slide. So I want to start at hope. I have done a few different versions of this presentation over the years, and I used to end with hope. But recently I've actually started with hope, and I've been finding that the flip of it is actually really useful framing, and it's probably one of the most consistent questions that I get working in this field is, what is hope? Where do we find hope? I'm in such despair. But, you know, what is this kind of dichotomy? How do I hold despair and hope together? So I imagine also as environmental educators, you're grappling with this yourselves quite a bit, and possibly with the people that you work with as well. So at PSC, we make a really critical distinction between wishful thinking and what we call constructive hope or active hope. Something like wishful thinking, you know, it's all going to be okay, I'm just going to, you know, cross my fingers and shut my eyes, can temporarily help when coping with anxiety, but it really is destructive in the long run, both, of course, in terms of the actual ecological crisis, but actually also in terms of our own mental endurance. It's really difficult to deal with disappointments when you're in an overly optimistic or unrealistically optimistic state, particularly if disappointments keep occurring. On the other hand, over-pessimism can kind of cause the same problem. It can cause a kind of paralysis. And that tends to be more of what I encounter, I guess, in my work in the environment space is people who are certainly realists and certainly pessimistic, but sometimes that pessimism can drift into what I would call over-pessimism, and that's where we sort of are cynically determined that we know exactly how it's all going to play out. And actually, active hope or grounded hope or even radical hope really encourage us to sit within the challenge of our not knowing. That the truth is, you know, our yearning for this more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible sits amidst the unraveling that's occurring around us every day. And holding both of those things together can be very uncomfortable. Sometimes it's easier to really sit in one camp or the other. But we really find that holding that tension and sitting in that uncertainty is where the most effective and sustained action can actually come from. And a really big part of being able to do that is to really know how you feel, make space for how you feel, and talk about how you feel with others. So I believe there's a really direct correlation between our capacity for hope and constructive action and our capacity to actually feel some of the more difficult feelings, like grief, like anger, like fear, and talk about them a bit more honestly with each other. And that's fairly countercultural still, particularly in professional spaces. And I do a lot of work with nature conservancy organisations and within the climate movement, where people are, you know, they're showing up as their professional selves, but all the same, they're holding a lot of really deep feeling about what's happening to the planet. And that deep feeling is driving why they're doing this work. And so it's important to kind of remain connected to that. So I also just want to start by giving a really brief explanation around climate and eco-distress, or what you might have heard referred to as eco-anxiety. It's, I guess, really a term that's been used to describe the source of stress caused by watching the slow and sort of irrevocable impacts of climate change unfold, and of course the multiple ecological crises associated with climate change. And it can entail worrying about the future for oneself and for children and other generations and other species. At PSC, we actually prefer the term eco-distress or climate distress. And we like this term better because it actually avoids pathologizing people who are feeling worried about the climate crisis. Distress actually conveys that this response is rational. That's a very rational response to have when we're looking at what's happening in the world around us. But it also covers a much wider sort of range of emotions and complex feelings that come up when we face ecological crisis. You know, it is more than anxiety. As I said, there can be grief, there can be anger, there can be shame, disgust, guilt. There can also be joy. And I don't mean joy like, wow, great, the planet's dying, but I mean the joy when we come together to really look at this and work on it. The sense of connection, and also the sense of joy that we feel when we are in places that we deeply love and that replenish us. So it's not all negative, I suppose, as well, the kind of array of ecological emotions that we might feel. And I think it's important to remember that. The other reason we sort of refer to distress more generally is for most people, all these feelings are happening in a bit of a swirl. They can be hard to sort of tease apart. And in any given day, we might flip between 5 different states, depending on information that we're reading or people that we're with and activities that we're undertaking. Eco-distress can also show itself in various ways. Obviously, concern about the climate, the planet, but also other sort of more physiological manifestations like sleep disturbance, poor concentration, an inability to kind of take pleasure in life, in things that maybe you used to enjoy. There can also be other questions like whether to have children, where to live, how to travel, you know, really deep questions that actually concern what it means to be human on this planet at this time. A recent study in 2021 of young people, 10,000 young people from 10 different countries all over the world, found that 56% of surveyed young people said humanity was doomed due to climate change. And that was about 50% of Australian respondents. 75% said the future is frightening because of climate change, and that was 76% of Australian respondents. And 39% said they were hesitant to have children, and 43% of those respondents were Australian. So there is a really significant correlation between feelings of climate anxiety or climate distress and inaction, government inaction in particular. It's very depressing when you're looking for leadership in this space, you're feeling distressed and you're just not seeing action take place. Really, a certain amount of fear, sadness, and distress are actually signs that we're alive and responsive to the context that we're living in. They can actually be taken as signs of aliveness, even though they're difficult ones. So the real question is, how do we learn to live with and even harness the power of these more difficult emotions? And that's what I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about today. The action suggested by Margaret Klein Salomon, who's a psychologist and founder of the climate mobilization in the US, wrote a great book called Facing the Climate Emergency, Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. And in this, she talks a lot about building your emotional muscle. And just to kind of take one step back here, often taking action in response to the inaction is one of the first things that people go to. And you might be familiar with that slogan, you know, the antidote to anxiety is action. And this is true. You know, it's very clear in all the research to date that taking action, being involved in our local groups, agitating for change really does help with mental coping. But when we overemphasize action and when we think that action has to look one particular kind of way, we can also see traits that stem from a general avoidance of emotions or even a culture of belittling of feelings. And we find that this often leads to burnout, alienation, and a kind of a struggle to find belonging. Because if you're having a lot of really big feelings and you can't talk about them, you tend to sort of retreat. So developing these skills around building our emotional muscle is one way that we can think about how we can keep engaging. So you can see there's sort of 4 steps she talks about. You could probably write an entire book about each of these steps, and I'm not going to go into them in a huge amount of depth. But the first is facing your feelings, or feeling your feelings is probably more the terminology I would use. Really making space in your life, possibly with others, probably ideally with others, to really feel how you feel, not just cognitively or intellectually, but physically, emotionally, somatically in your body. The next step is accepting your feelings. So not making them bad or wrong, not trying to get rid of them, not trying to repress them, but actually using them as really useful information, getting curious, offering yourself some compassion. Oh, I'm really, really struggling at the moment. I'm having a hard time. How can I support myself? So rather than repressing, we're kind of delving further into them. And this can be a bit counterintuitive at first. Sometimes we think, oh my God, if I actually let myself feel everything that I felt, I will just be a puddle on the floor and I will never sort of materialize again into human form. I'll get mired in that space. But actually the opposite is true. And certainly this is my experience in doing this work for myself, but also over the last 10 years of facilitating this kind of work with participants. People actually conversely find that a lot of energy can kind of be released and explored and found, particularly when these places are gone to in the context of a shared group process and not just on your own. And the other thing that I'll mention is that repressing feelings actually takes a hell of a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to keep everything kind of bundled in a corner. And so this idea that we're somehow saving ourselves energy by not going there is a bit of a misnomer as well. All right, just go on to this one. This is just a quick little equation that I like to remind people of. So suffering equals pain times by resistance. Now, we can't really get around the reality that there is pain associated with engaging in this work. There's pain associated in just being human, but suffering really arises when we kind of resist that pain that's a part of it. A lot of the time we tend to use avoidance, denial, repression, disassociation and disavowal to kind of avoid our pain, and that's where we get into the kind of multiplication area. All of those things would sort of fit under the resistance category. Dissociation really disturbs normal links between thoughts, feelings and actions, and it can range between a kind of mild out-of-body sort of zoning out experience to amnesia, and even in the very extreme end of cases, multiple personality disorder. So when you dissociate, you're losing touch with what's actually happening around you and with what you know is true. And of course, if we're thinking about trying to take action and trying to take wise action, the ground of what is really happening matters quite a bit. Of course, it's pretty understandable that a lot of us are pretty numbed out a lot of the time. And I know for myself, I certainly, even in doing this work, spend a fair amount of time numbed out and doing a bit of scrolling on my phone. So I don't want to demonize that either. You know, there is a place for feeling numb. And often our numbness is actually a part of our grief. It's the surface part that we're able to feel, and the bottom stuff we can't kind of get into so much. So sometimes our numbness can also be a bit of our own wisdom about what we're able to engage with in the present moment. So that would be, I guess, my first maybe my first bit of unsolicited advice, is just, if you are feeling numb, to take that as important evidence that there probably are other things going on under the surface, and to kind of go gently there. So this sort of moves into the body of really much of the work that PSC does, which is, it's essentially grief work. And we do need to feel our grief. We need to grieve, because we're not in denial when we're grieving wholeheartedly. And in fact, grief is the best method that we have for reacting to meaningful losses and for adapting to new realities, for processing realities. Because if we can't process reality, we can't live in reality. And grief is a really important, I guess, organic tool that we have to do that. And the initial task of grief is just to help us accept the reality of the loss. And this it often helps us understand the depth of our love. And sometimes, I know for me, feeling the fuel of love that's underneath that grief or even that anger can be a very powerful way through toward finding that energy to engage once again. But it's really important that we grieve in the company of others where we can. If we try to do it all on our own, we end up kind of being the grieving person and the container, and we can't ever really let it all go. We can't ever really let it all drop. So rather than processing the grief, it just sort of keeps circling and circling around in our bodies. So I think we really need to recover our right to ask for help in our grieving. And that's part of what we do at PSC as well. There's one last slide about grief there. Of course, there are many other kinds of ecological emotions. I don't want to pretend that grief is the only one. It's definitely not. But I would say it's the one we have probably one of the biggest societal and cultural blocks around, and it is something that makes a very big difference, which is why I'm focusing on it today. This is a quote from one of our PSC facilitators, and she's a wonderful Australian-based researcher. And I think this really says it all. You know, when we grieve for what is lost, it clears the way toward a strengthening of love and a commitment for what remains. Grief can make us very sad and very motivated to act. So PSC runs workshops around lots of different topics, but there's usually a central piece around grief. And we really support people in expressing how they're feeling and talking to each other about it. And what we find is, in the presence of others, that sense of isolation really falls away, and that recovery of a sense of common humanity and a capacity to work together sort of conversely emerges, which sort of brings me back to that first slide. People really come out of our workshops kind of paradoxically feeling very hopeful, having just spent 3 hours talking about how awful they feel. So yeah, it's definitely a paradox. And yeah, I guess I would say if you're experiencing lots of these feelings, you might consider checking out some of PSC's work. But what we'll do right now is actually just a chance for you to experience in real time a very small kind of taster of some of the work we do. And this is an exercise called Open Sentences. And I'll just stop sharing my screen now for the moment. It's an exercise called Open Sentences, and you'll be in breakout rooms. There'll be 3 people in each breakout room. There might be